about this. GE confirming just now it is cutting 12,000 jobs as it shrinks its power.
You're already seeing it, aren't you? It's already starting to impact your business.
Very much so.
But he also just made an announcement of an expansion of the existing 25% tariffs that were imposed on steel. Those will now be doubling, according.
In a piece of news that has shaken American industry, General Electric has just announced it will shut down a series of factories in the United States and move its production lines overseas. Once a name regarded as a symbol of U.S. manufacturing, this decision marks nothing less than a turning point in the nation's economic landscape. Behind this move lies the consequence of President Trump's hardline tariff policies, originally designed to protect domestic jobs, but now delivering unforeseen fallout. As trade tensions continue to escalate, GE's departure from its home base raises difficult questions. Is protectionism truly protecting anyone? And what price is ultimately being paid? Is this a strategy to adapt to the realities of a globalized economy, or a warning sign of a deeper decline in America as industrial might? GE's recent announcement to close numerous plants across the Midwest and Northeast has sent shockwaves through the very heart of America's industrial belt. These factories were not just production sites. For decades, they embodied innovation, economic strength, and the pride of the American middle class. Now, with machinery falling silent and assembly lines coming to a halt, thousands of workers are left facing an uncertain future. GE's decision to relocate production overseas is not merely a business choice. It reflects a profound shift in how supply chains are organized, underscoring how difficult it has become for the United States to sustain a competitive edge under current conditions. Once the gold standard of U.S. manufacturing, GE is now moving large portions of its operations to Mexico, Eastern Europe, and Southeast Asia, regions offering lower labor costs and more favorable tariff regimes. Company executives have emphasized that this is not a temporary fix. It is a long-term strategy to rebuild a global supply network capable of withstanding political risk, trade disputes, and rising domestic cost. Beyond the cost-saving rationale lies a deeper structural concern. America's industrial base is increasingly unable to compete on price. While other countries roll out tax incentives and pro-investment policies, U.S. plants have been slower to adapt. This is why GE has chosen to prioritize regions with greater flexibility, cheaper inputs, and stronger logistical infrastructure. The move also highlights a fundamental shift in the global economy. The era of manufacturing concentrated in one nation has ended, giving way to a dispersed model tied to sources of raw materials, labor pools, and consumer markets. The case of GE is a clear illustration of this trend. In recent years, many companies have quietly shifted production lines to places with lower costs and fewer regulatory constraints. But given GE's vast scale, influence, and long history, its move has become a stark warning to the entire industry. It signals that if even a company as iconic as GE cannot maintain its footing in the United States, smaller firms will face exponentially greater challenges in their struggle to survive. The decision has also unleashed a wave of anxiety in communities long tied to GE's facilities. Towns that once grew and thrived around these plants now face the loss of thousands of jobs, shrinking tax revenues, and the erosion of their local economies. Many mayors and state governments are scrambling to put forward tax incentives, financial aid, or retraining programs to prevent their citizens from falling into crisis. Yet, many fear these efforts may already be too late. Beyond economics, the psychological impact is even heavier. For many Americans, General Electric has never been just a company. It has been part of the national story of strength and resilience. Its factories once stood as symbols of steady employment, working-class pride, and discipline in production. When those factory gates close, it is not only the loss of jobs. It is a fracture in the belief that American industry can be revived through political slogans or lofty promises from leaders. The withdrawal also exposes the fierce global competition to dominate manufacturing. As GE packs up equipment and relocates operations abroad, it is not just transferring assembly lines, but also moving technical processes, supply contracts, and accumulated know-how to foreign partners. This is not merely capital investment. It is the transfer of technology, expertise, and strategic advantage factors that can tilt the balance of economic power. In the long run, the absence of large-scale production facilities on US soil will weaken the nation's ability to remain self-sufficient in sectors considered pillars of national security. For GE, this is not simply about cutting domestic costs. It is about adapting to a global environment where production must be flexible, scalable, and less vulnerable to political shocks. With automation, geopolitical tensions, and consumer demand shifting constantly, corporations like GIE are forced to make restructuring choices that will redraw the industrial map for the next generation of products. In reality, many of GE's plans had already been idled, while months of closed-door meetings examined every possible option. From restructuring production lines, investing in robotics, and reducing working hours to renegotiating with unions, each solution was modeled with forecasts and detailed cost scenarios. Yet, in the end, none could guarantee profitability under the weight of global inflation and rising tariffs. GE also tried to accelerate automation in a bid to reduce reliance on labor and boost output. Modern robotics and advanced assembly systems were tested and showed positive results. At the same time, the company entered into difficult talks with unions, proposing wage freezes, adjusted benefits, and extended shifts. Some concessions were achieved, but they were still not enough to offset the soaring costs of raw materials and transportation. JUI's deliberations extended beyond labor and technology to include consolidating its supply chain and streamlining non-core operations. Smaller plants were proposed for closure or conversion into specialized centers. Yet most scenarios still resulted in eroded profit margins. Import tariffs on steel and semiconductors had made it nearly impossible to strike a balance between cost and quality. Even the idea of locating plants in states with tax incentives proved insufficient, as existing infrastructure was inadequate and required massive investment to restructure. Federal assistance packages were either too modest or came with conditions incompatible with GE's diverse product portfolio. After exhaustive assessments from multiple angles, company leadership reached a stark conclusion. Maintaining domestic production would mean enduring long-term losses. This was not a matter of GE lacking innovation, but rather the reality that the cost environment had become too punishing to manage. Throughout its history, GE had survived recessions, market crashes, and technological disruptions. But this time, the challenge struck directly at its core operating model. The consequences are already evident. Communities once thriving on jobs and tax revenues are now staring at fiscal shortfalls. Schools, hospitals, and roads, all dependent on revenues from production, are now facing funding gaps. In many towns, local councils convened emergency meetings, but constrained budgets left little room for effective action. For people, the toll is even heavier. For many families, GE was more than an employer. It was a source of stability passed down from one generation to the next. Parents once worked night shifts, passed down their skills to their children, and entire communities revolved around the rhythm of the factory. Now, all of it has vanished in an instant, leaving behind empty parking lots, idle machinery, and families grappling with unemployment. Media coverage captured aerial footage, showing the decline unfolding almost in real time. Interviews with laid-off workers revealed the psychological burden, not only the loss of income, but the erosion of an entire community's identity. For many, the pain runs deeper than financial damage. This story also raises serious questions about hardline tariff policies. The argument that patriotism and a willingness to accept higher costs would be enough to preserve domestic manufacturing now appears fragile. The case of GE demonstrates that without a viable policy framework and long-term incentives, even industrial icons are compelled to look abroad. This is not a failure of adaptation. It is proof that the system itself is constrained by fundamental limits. The issue at stake is no longer simply about profit. It reflects the boundaries of an economic strategy in an era where capital, skills, and supply chains move freely beyond all national borders. The financial market's reaction to General Electric's restructuring plan has been just as complex as the decision itself. Immediately after the announcement, both the company's share price and investor sentiment showed visible turbulence. Analysts quickly pointed out the inevitable short-term costs GE would face, shutting down domestic plants, dismantling and shipping equipment abroad, and setting up production lines under entirely new regulatory frameworks. On top of that, the company must spend heavily on recruiting, training, and managing a foreign workforce unfamiliar with GE's strict operational standards. These costs translate into near-term profit risks compounded by unpredictable fluctuations in the geopolitical environment. Still, many investors are looking further ahead, betting that GE will reap significant benefits once its new facilities are fully up and running. Several forecasting models have been revised to reflect the potential for as much as a 20% reduction in production costs in the future, driven by lower wages, tax incentives, and streamlined customs procedures in the selected countries. For hedge funds and portfolio managers, this is a story about recovery prospects and renewed competitive advantage. Some even see it as a bold move to modernize GE's aging manufacturing model, especially against the backdrop of rising inflation and soaring input costs in the United States. Global trends are also shaping capital flows. Many multinational corporations are making similar moves, seeking more stable regulatory environments and predictable trade relations. Vietnam, Poland, and Mexico have emerged as attractive destinations for production reallocation. As such, GE's story does not stand alone, but forms part of a broader wave of industrial migration. Investment banks have even released projection reports suggesting that within 3 to 5 years, this shift could bolster GE's competitiveness. The edge lies in positioning plants closer to emerging markets, which both shortens delivery times and makes it easier to tailor products to local demand. This flexibility is particularly crucial in sectors like medical equipment and energy systems, where needs vary greatly between regions. However, while the financial outlook may appear optimistic, the social response tells a different story. American consumers are increasingly questioning GOE's commitment to its homeland. As goods sold domestically now often bear a foreign label, the company has repeatedly insisted it still views the US as its core market. Yet in practice, the phrase "made in USA" is steadily disappearing from its products. For many generations, this represents a symbolic loss, as GE was once synonymous with American manufacturing pride. The headquarters may remain in the United States, but the factories and production lines no longer do. This gap has sparked a broader debate. Does a product still represent a nation if it is not actually made there? Lower prices may please shareholders and attract buyers, but the social and cultural costs are far harder to measure. More and more scholars and economists are asking, are the benefits of globalization truly worth the trade-off of a weakened domestic industrial capacity, once considered a fundamental measure of America's strength? The impact of General Electric's decision extends well beyond the company itself, reverberating across the entire U.S. industrial sector. Countless manufacturers are now being forced to reassess their long-term strategies. Many reviews are underway to determine whether it still makes sense to maintain large-scale facilities on American soil. Industry giants like Honeywell and Caterpillar have already begun drafting contingency scenarios, calculating what might happen if trade tensions continue indefinitely. Supply chain consultancies report a surge in requests as corporations seek offshore alternatives. From boardrooms in New York to Chicago, GE's departure has compelled business leaders to revisit the fundamental question: is manufacturing in the United States still competitive? Keeping plants at home is becoming increasingly difficult to justify, especially when rivals can so easily cut costs by shifting production abroad. Even brands historically tied to the national image are under pressure from shareholders to prioritize profit above all else. This raises the prospect of a slow but steady exodus of manufacturing facilities leaving American territory. Government authorities have not overlooked these developments. Several states have rushed to roll out tax incentive packages to keep industries local. At the federal level, officials are debating whether tariff policies should be revised to slow the outflow of capital in factories. Yet many experts worry that such measures amount to little more than stopgap solutions. Without a comprehensive industrial strategy, one that balances global competitiveness with domestic stability, the United States may be headed toward a prolonged decline in manufacturing. In this context, GE's decision stands as a powerful signal, not only to the market, but also to the political class. The central question is this: how can the short-term interests of shareholders be reconciled with the long-term interests of the nation? For the reality is clear. Industrial strength cannot be restored with a few tariffs or patriotic slogans. Businesses will go where the greatest economic benefits are found. That is the essence of Xi's choice, and the logic now shaping the future of American manufacturing as a whole. As investors adjust their strategies, corporate leaders revisit forecasts, and workers worry about the road ahead. One reality is becoming clear. America's industrial map is being redrawn, and General Electric is at the forefront. Xi's decision to abandon domestic plants is not merely a managerial shift. It reflects broader trends that are reshaping the global economy. GE is not acting simply in pursuit of short-term profit. The company is responding to a global reality where manufacturing has long transcended national borders. In this environment, supply chains stretch across continents. Labor forces shift constantly, and corporations are compelled to seek the most favorable conditions to survive and expand. The traditional notion that production must be tied to one's home country rooted in pride or loyalty is increasingly difficult to uphold under the weight of global competition and cost pressures. For decades, the United States enjoyed industrial dominance, but that status is no longer guaranteed. Trade wars, soaring costs, and outdated infrastructure are creating conditions in which even iconic corporations cannot remain static. Xi's departure is therefore a wake-up call for policymakers. Unless Washington quickly adapts its rules and economic policies to this new reality, the wave of production relocation will continue, and the U.S. risks losing both industrial advantage and strategic leadership. This move also exposes the weakness of rigid protectionist policies. Tariffs may provide temporary relief for certain sectors, but they cannot replace genuine competitiveness. Xi's decision highlights the limits of relying on trade barriers alone to revive manufacturing. In fact, such measures may accelerate decline as rising costs drive investment elsewhere. When a company so deeply woven into America's identity as GIE is compelled to leave, it reveals that the issue lies not only in trade, but in the very foundations of the economy that must be rebuilt. What the U.S. faces is not just an economic challenge, but a long-term strategic test. The world will not wait for Washington's industrial nostalgia. Other countries are moving swiftly to seize opportunities, rolling out targeted incentives, building modern infrastructure, and reforming education to align with new production needs. Without a clear, forward-looking industrial policy, the United States risks falling behind. GE shift is not solely a loss. It is also a reminder that America must ask itself what kind of economy it wishes to build. Will it cling to the past, or proactively prepare for the future? The answer cannot come from slogans or retaliatory trade measures, but from practical strategy, data-driven planning, and the alignment of national interests with global opportunities. At this crossroads, America's future will depend on whether it turns Xi's decision into a catalyst for renewal or allows it to stand as a marker of decline.